The Vikings lived in a place where winter was long, cold, and often dangerous. They didn't have modern heating or warm houses like we do today. Still, they managed to survive these harsh conditions by working together and using what they had in smart ways. When the freezing weather came, the Vikings moved into their longhouses. These were large wooden homes, built low to the ground to keep heat inside. The walls were made from timber if there were trees nearby. Otherwise, they used turf sod or stone. Inside, longhouses were crowded, smoky, and not very comfortable. But they were warm. Several families and even animals like cows would live in the same space. This might sound strange, but animals gave off body heat, which helped keep the place warm. It wasn't about coziness, it was about staying alive. At the center of the longhouse was a hearth, a fire pit used for cooking and heating. There were no chimneys. The smoke from the fire would rise into the roof and slowly find its way out, or just stay hanging in the air. Over time, the ceiling turned black, and the Vikings' lungs suffered from all the smoke, but still, it was better than freezing. Everyone slept on raised platforms along the walls, often filled with straw or moss. These beds were shared, not for love, but because body heat was important. Even goats and sheep slept inside. Viking clothes were all about staying warm. Forget fashion, they dressed to survive. Men wore wool tunics and trousers with leg wraps, like old-fashioned thermal pants. Women wore long wool dresses with aprons and cloaks. Everyone used belts to carry tools and sometimes emergency food like cheese. Wool was the main material, but they also used fur and leather. Cloaks were crucial. Without one, a Viking wouldn't last long outdoors. Their boots were made from animal hides, waterproof with fat. These boots weren't pretty, but they worked. Sometimes they even made raincoats out of clean animal intestines. That might sound gross, but it kept them dry. The cold affected what they ate, too. Vikings knew that in the winter, food was more than just nutrition. It was heat. They ate a lot of calories to stay warm. Their meals were heavy and full of fat, not fancy, but practical. Meat, dairy, grains, and preserved fish were their main foods. They smoked, salted, and dried fish to make it last. One dish, called lutefisk, was fish soaked in lye. It didn't taste good, but it didn't spoil either. Stews were popular. Vikings would throw whatever they had into a pot: meat, root vegetables, oats, sour milk, and let it cook all day. The result was thick, hot food that filled their bellies. Dairy like cheese and butter was made in warmer months and safe for winter. Their cheese was hard, salty, and built to last, even if it tasted like a rock. They also had a sour, high-protein food called skyr, which was somewhere between cheese and yogurt. It wasn't tasty, but it kept people going. Viking bread was made from barley or rye. It was heavy and dark. Sometimes they even mixed in tree bark to stretch the flour further. Not delicious, but it kept them alive. And, of course, there was alcohol. Ale and mead were common. These drinks weren't just for fun. They were full of calories and helped people relax when their toes went numb. Mead, a honey-based drink, was especially useful in helping them forget they lived in a smoky shed with cows and 6 other people. The Vikings also brought animals indoors for warmth. Chickens, pigs, goats, and cows often shared the longhouse. They were kept in a section called the byre, like a stable attached to the house. A low wall separated the animals from the people, but not by much. On really cold nights, the humans might sleep closer to the animals. Kids might nap beside a sheep. If a cow was warm and didn't mind, someone might even use it as a pillow. Not comfy, but very warm. There were downsides, of course: the noise, the smell, and the occasional hoof to the head. But Vikings didn't complain. They knew warmth was more important than dignity. Animals inside also meant they were safe from thieves, wild animals, and the freezing cold outside. Livestock were more than just food. They were heaters and security systems. The longhouses were designed with survival in mind. Builders made sure the heat from the animal section could move into the family's area. It wasn't fancy architecture, but it worked. Vikings didn't aim for comfort. They aimed to make it through the night. Most importantly, Vikings had each other. Huddling together wasn't just a way to stay warm. It was a way to stay sane. Kids, adults, and even pets slept together on raised platforms covered in furs. Privacy didn't exist. Comfort was rare, but shared warmth kept them alive. Old people were treated like sacred heat sources. Dogs and cats weren't pets. They were space heaters with tails. Everyone packed in close, breathing smoky air. and ignoring Uncle Bjorn's snoring. Being stuck inside all winter could make people lose their minds. That's where Viking humor came in. They told stories and sang songs, even ones about freezing to death heroically. They joked with each other and teased family members. Laughing helped fight off sadness and boredom. They also held feasts. In the middle of winter, they bring out food they had saved since fall. It wasn't just to celebrate. It reminded everyone, we're still here, and look, we even have turnips. Vikings played games indoors, like board games and wrestling matches. Sometimes they'd knock over a goat or two. These games weren't just fun. They were distractions from the cold, the dark, and the fear that spring might never come. But the biggest reason they survived winter, their attitude. Vikings expected winter to be hard. They didn't whine about it. They prepared for it. Cold, hunger, and discomfort were just part of life. You didn't complain. You adapted. When we think of staying warm in winter today, we imagine insulation, soft foam, fiberglass, and fancy wall materials. But the Vikings didn't have any of that. Their idea of insulation was simple. Use nature. Stuff the walls with whatever they could find and hope it kept the cold out. Viking longhouses were built to trap heat. If they lived near trees, they used timber. If not, they used turf and stone. These walls were thick, sometimes as thick as 1 whole meter, to keep warmth inside. In between the logs or stones, they packed in straw, moss, animal hair, or mud. It wasn't clean or fancy, and you wouldn't want to lean on it barefoot, but it worked. The roof was another key part. It was usually made of sod. That means dirt and grass. That might sound weird today, but turf roofs were great at holding in warmth and keeping out rain. If you were lucky, weeds or mushrooms might grow up there too. Bonus salad, maybe. The floor inside the longhouse was just packed dirt, sometimes covered with straw or dried plants. This helped keep people off the freezing ground. They changed it only when the smell got too bad. There were no big windows. Glass was too expensive. And anyway, what was the point of big windows when it was dark for months? Instead, light came from the fire or small smoke holes in the roof. The house was dark, earthy, and warmish, just enough to survive the cold. This kind of house might seem rough now, but it was smart. Vikings turned their homes into slow cookers filled with body, heat, goat breath, and fire smoke. It wasn't luxurious, but it was just enough to keep everyone from freezing. And when the wind outside howled like a monster, the Vikings stayed put, snuggled under layers of fur, straw, and wool. Sleeping in a Viking longhouse wasn't like sleeping in a cozy bed. There were no sheets, no soft pillows, and no private bedrooms. Instead, people slept on wooden platforms raised slightly above the floor. These platforms were lined with straw, moss, or hay, and then covered with furs and wool blankets, or whatever they had that was soft and didn't smell too bad. Whole families slept together. Parents, kids, grandparents, sometimes even animals, all sharing body heat. You didn't change into pajamas. You just stayed in your clothes and climbed into bed. Taking your clothes off in freezing temperatures was a bad idea. People even slept in their boots. It might sound uncomfortable, but frostbite didn't care about your comfort. Infants were wrapped tightly and held close. Kids were often placed between adults so they'd stay warm. It wasn't about cuddling. It was about surviving. Everyone became part of a giant, human meatloaf wrapped in wool and fur. There was no modesty. If someone's foot ended up on your leg, that was just part of the deal. If you had a bearskin blanket, you were either rich, very lucky, or brave enough to hunt something big and scary in the snow. And if the fire went out in the middle of the night, you didn't get up right away. You just pulled someone closer and muttered something like, "Don't steal the fur again." Of course, the air in these longhouses wasn't exactly fresh. Remember, there were no chimneys. The smoke was supposed to drift up through holes in the roof, but in reality, it hung in the air, turning the ceiling black and settling in everyone's lungs. You didn't breathe clean air. You breathed what people before you had already breathed. Some people tried to sleep closer to the floor to avoid the smoke. Others built their beds higher, but most just lived with it, coughing as they stirred the stew and hoped they didn't trip over a goat in the dark. Some richer Viking homes had actual smoke holes that worked a little better, but for most, the smoke was just part of the lifestyle. It dried out meat hanging from the ceiling, kept away bugs, and gave the house a smoky smell that would stay in your clothes forever. Not great for your lungs, but pretty good for your leftovers. And when the darkest days of the year came, when the sun barely showed up, the Vikings turned to something even more powerful than fire. Celebration. They knew that joy was a weapon against the cold and the dark, so they threw a party. This celebration was called Yule. It happened around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. Yule was part religious holiday, part survival trick, and part excuse to eat every last preserved sausage in sight. It could last for days or even weeks, depending on how much meat people had saved. The point of Yule wasn't just fun, it was hope. It reminded people they were still alive. Families gathered, fires were lit, and animals were sacrificed, both as offerings and as dinner. Big bonfires were built to scare off the night. These weren't small, cozy fires. These were giant, roaring flames that said, "We're still here." People feasted on dried meat, drank ale and mead, and told sagas, long, epic stories about heroes and gods, and they sang loudly. Viking singing wasn't beautiful. It was more like yelling in tune while trying to scare a thunderstorm. But it felt good. It lifted spirits and filled the dark with life. There was also the Yule log, not the chocolate cake kind, but a real, giant log that burned for days. It symbolized warmth, light, and the hope that winter would end. Supernatural. Beliefs were strong during this time, too. Vikings thought that spirits and trolls roamed freely in the dark months, so they left out offerings and performed rituals to keep the spirits calm and to stop them from stealing the family goat. A lot of modern Christmas traditions come from Yule. Evergreen trees, feasting, giving gifts, these all go back to Viking celebrations. But at its core, Yule wasn't about presents. It was about making it through the darkest time of the year, together. In a world with no electric lights, no vitamin pills, and no escape from the cold, the Vikings found joy with fire, food, and each other. They believed that the dark wouldn't last forever, and if it did, well, at least they had mead, stories, and something to laugh about before they froze. If the Vikings had a secret weapon against winter, it wasn't swords or axes. It was wool. Wool was everywhere in Viking life. They wore it, slept under it, and even stuffed it into the walls of their homes. Wool was more valuable than silver, and sometimes even more important than food, because without it, you wouldn't survive the cold. Why wool? Because it stayed warm even when it got wet. Unlike cotton, which turns cold and soggy in the snow, wool keeps its warmth. It's like magic fuzz. Viking families, especially on farms, raised sheep mostly for their wool. Spinning and weaving it into yarn was a year-round job, mostly done by women and children. During winter, this work felt even more important. It was like spinning life-saving armor. Everyone wore wool. Men had wool tunics, pants, leg wraps, and cloaks. Women had layered wool dresses, aprons, and scarves. Hats and mittens were made from felted wool. Well, that was beaten and soaked until it turned into a dense, windproof mat. Vikings didn't care about fashion. They cared about survival. Their clothes were practical, often patched and handed down for generations. Even scraps were saved to make socks or stuffing. If you had a good wool cloak, you kept it for years, unless it burned in a fire or was buried with you. Wealthy Vikings sometimes had dyed wool in reds or blues, but most people wore natural sheep colors, brown, gray, and beige. Soft wool was rare and expensive. Most folks wore the itchy kind and didn't complain, because itchy and warm was better than soft and frozen. But the Vikings didn't stop at wool. They also had something surprising for such a cold weather culture: steam baths. Yes, you read that right. The same people who lived in smoke-filled huts also liked to sit in tiny, smoky steam rooms. These Viking saunas were called badstofa. They were built from stone and turf. Inside, they heated rocks and poured water on them to make steam. People sat inside sweating in the heat, while snow piled up outside. Why would they do this? For one thing, it cleaned their skin. The hot steam helped them sweat out dirt and grime. But more than that, it made them feel alive. Some even ran outside afterward to roll in the snow or jump into icy water. This hot and cold routine wasn't just for fun. It boosted blood flow, cleared out stuffy noses, and probably made people forget how miserable the weather was for a little while. Saunas also brought people together. Families used them, and sometimes they were even used for giving birth or healing wounds. In the Viking mind, if something needed fixing, a person, a problem, or a mood, the solution was to heat it up, then freeze it. Modern Nordic countries still love saunas today, and it all started with Vikings cooking themselves a little. Huts dot a course. Surviving the cold wasn't just about warmth. It was also about surviving the boredom. Winter in Viking lands meant long, Dark months stuck inside. No farming, no sailing, no raiding. Just you, your family, and a smoky room filled with ghosts and gossip. So how did they keep from going crazy? They stayed busy. Winter was the perfect time for fixing things, weapons, tools, clothing. If your shirt had a hole, you sewed it. If your axe was dull, you sharpened it. Vikings didn't waste time, especially now when everything they owned had to last. Spinning and weaving wool took up a lot of time. People sat by the fire, turning fleece into yarn into clothes, and clothes into warmth. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life-saving. Every stitch mattered, and while they worked, they talked, or they told stories. Vikings didn't have books or TVs, but they had sagas, long, exciting stories about gods, warriors, monsters, and family drama. These tales were passed down by memory. Each person told it a little differently, adding details to keep it interesting. Some were funny, some were sad. All were a way to stay connected and keep hope alive in the dark months. They also played games, board games like Nefertafel, kind of like chess, but more confusing and full of betrayal. Dice games were popular, too. Some families held riddle, contests, or even mock fights when things got too quiet. Wrestling was a common indoor sport, sometimes knocking over furniture or livestock in the process. And of course, there was mead. Alcohol helped ease stress, made stories funnier. It sometimes helped people ignore their cramped living conditions. It wasn't fancy wine. It was strong, sweet, and made from honey. It helped people loosen up and on the roughest nights, maybe forget how cold their toes were. But underneath all of this, the wool, the fire, the games was something deeper, mindset. The Vikings expected winter to be hard. They didn't see it as a disaster. They saw it as a test, a challenge, a season to be endured, not feared. They didn't feel sorry for themselves. They prepared, worked, joked, and kept moving. Children were raised to be tough. If your fingers were cold, you rubbed them. If your feet were numb, you stomped them. If you fell in ice and lived, people laughed and then told stories about it forever. Vikings didn't baby their problems. They dealt with them. Was it healthy? Maybe not. But it worked. Their stories and religion also supported this attitude. Viking mythology was full of frost giants, endless winters, and gods who never gave up. There was even a myth about a winter so bad it would destroy the world, Fimbulwinter. So when snow fell in real life, Vikings didn't panic. They'd heard worse in their bedtime stories. They believed in survival, not comfort. Warmth came from fire, fur, and family. Strength came from laughing in the cold and patching the roof instead of complaining about it. That was the Viking way. The Vikings knew something very important. No one gets through winter alone. It didn't matter how strong you were, how warm your cloak was, or how big your longhouse was. You needed other people. Viking society was built around this idea. Family, friends, neighbors. Everyone depended on each other to make it through the cold months alive. Vikings didn't live by themselves in the middle of nowhere. They lived in small villages or farms close to one another. These groups were often made up of extended family and trusted allies. That meant if your house needed repair, someone helped you fix it. If your firewood ran out, someone shared theirs. If your child got sick, someone offered herbs, prayers, or just sat with you through the night. Helping others wasn't just kindness, it was smart. If your neighbors didn't survive the winter, that meant fewer hands for planting crops, building boats, or defending the village in spring. Helping others was a way to help yourself dot during midwinter at feasts like Yule. This idea became even more important. People shared food, drink, stories, and jokes. These celebrations reminded everyone, we're still here, and we're not alone. These parties weren't just about fun, they were like glue, keeping the group strong and connected when the cold tried to tear people apart. The way Vikings stored food also showed this community mindset. They didn't always hoard everything in their own homes. Some villages had shared storehouses, places where grain, meat, and smoked fish were kept for everyone. That way, if one family ran out, others could help, not because they were being nice, but because if one family starved, it put the whole village at risk. Leaders in Viking society had a job beyond giving orders. They had to keep people warm and safe. Local chieftains and spiritual leaders called Gothi helped organize firewood collections and food sharing. They made sure no one froze or went hungry, because if they failed, they lost respect. In Viking culture, a good leader was someone who could settle a fight and make sure the stapot stayed full. And if someone tried to cheat the system, say, by hiding extra food or not doing their chores, the rest of the village noticed. Shame was a powerful tool. Being judged by your whole community was worse than punishment. Everyone needed to pull their weight, especially in winter. Even Viking justice was shaped by the seasons. If someone stole food in the middle of winter, it wasn't just a crime, it was a threat to survival. Some leaders might show mercy, others wouldn't. But everyone understood winter was serious. There was no room for selfishness where the snow came and the wind howled. What really saved the Vikings wasn't just fire or fur, it was togetherness. Every joke, every shared turnip, every hour spent weaving by the hearth helped keep people going. Warmth was shared, struggles were shared. That's what kept the Viking world turning. And the Vikings never stopped adapting. If the house got drafty, they stuffed moss into the cracks. If the stick got thin, they added turnips. If someone was sad, they told a funny story or wrestled a cousin into the hay. They didn't wait for spring. They made winter work for them. There was no central heating, so they built smarter fires. There were no waterproof jackets, so they made them out of sheep guts. There were no mental health doctors, so they told stories, drank mead, and made each other laugh. Sometimes at things that probably weren't polite, but were absolutely necessary. Even when other people slowed down in winter, the Vikings kept going. They repaired weapons. They taught their children. They told old stories and invented new ideas. When spring finally came, they didn't crawl out of their houses like survivors. They burst out ready to plant, build, and even raid again. Winter didn't make them weaker. It made them tougher, smarter, and more creative. Their success didn't come from magic. It came from hard work, good planning, and stubborn teamwork. Whether they were steaming in a sauna, sleeping under a goat, or eating yogurt that tasted like sadness, they did it together, and they did it well. Asterisk, the Viking longhouse was more than just a home. It was a survival tool. Everything about it, from the walls to the roof, was made with one goal in mind: keep people alive through the freezing months. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't comfortable, but it worked. Most longhouses were large, low buildings with thick walls. If the Vikings lived near forests, they used timber for the frame. If not, they used turf, mud, and stone, whatever was around. The walls could be up to a meter thick. Between the logs or stones, they stuffed anything they could find that helped trap heat: moss, straw, mud, animal hair. It didn't smell great, and it definitely wasn't soft, but it helped keep out the cold air. Roofs were usually made from turf. That means grass and dirt, literal chunks of land laid on top of wooden frames. This wasn't some trendy eco design. Turf roofs were excellent at keeping the warmth inside and keeping rain and snow out. Plus, they were heavy and stayed put in strong winds inside the longhouse. The floor was usually just dirt, packed down until it was hard. Some families covered it with straw or dry grass to make it a little softer and warmer. These layers were changed only when the smell became too much to handle. Windows were almost non-existent. Glass was expensive and rare, so instead, longhouses had small openings or smoke holes in the roof. These let in a little bit of light and hopefully let some smoke out. The rest of the light came from the fire in the center of the house, and if it was pitch black outside for months, which it often was, the Vikings didn't care much about sunlight anyway. The fire in the middle of the house was the heart of Viking life in winter. It gave off heat, cooked the food, and kept wild animals away. It also filled the house with smoke. There were no chimneys, so smoke drifted upward and slowly escaped, or didn't. The roof beams turned black, and everyone's lungs got a daily workout. But the smoke had its uses. It helped dry meat and fish hanging from the rafters and kept bugs away. These longhouses didn't meet any modern building codes, but they were tough. They were like giant thermoses, trapping every bit of warmth. They could, and they had to be, outside. The cold was deadly. Sleeping arrangements in the longhouse were built for warmth, not privacy. Raised platforms lined the walls. These were the beds, shared by entire families and sometimes animals. They were covered with straw, furs, and wool. People didn't wear pajamas. They just slept in their clothes. Changing clothes at night meant freezing, so everything stayed on. Boots, cloaks, hats, all part of bedtime fashion. Even babies were bundled up and tucked between warm adults. Kids were used as little heaters. Dogs and cats weren't pets. They were foot warmers. There was no such thing as a quiet, peaceful night. There was coughing, snoring, and the occasional goat kicking someone in their sleep. But again, this wasn't about comfort. It was about surviving. Some homes had heated stones, rocks warmed by the fire and placed under bedding. It was like the Viking version of a hot water bottle. Heavy, possibly dangerous, but warm. If the fire burned out during the night, no one jumped up to relight it. They just scooted closer to someone else and hoped for morning. The air in the house was thick with smoke. In theory, it was supposed to rise and escape. In reality, it hovered. Children and older people had it worst. Being shorter, they breathed in more of the smoke. Some families tried to build sleeping platforms at just the right height to avoid it. Others just lived with it. A few fancier houses had real vents or better airflow. But for most Vikings, smoke was just part of the air. You didn't breathe fresh air. You breathed air that had passed through a dozen other lungs. It made your chest feel heavy, but it kept your meat fresh and your home free of insects. And if it got too smoky, you opened the door that let out the smoke and let in freezing air. Your lungs felt better, but your toes turned blue. There was always a trade-off. But for all the hardship, the longhouse was still home. It was where families ate, talked, sang, played games, and waited out the winter together. It smelled like smoke, old meat, and animals, but also like survival. And when you stood outside and saw the wind whip across the snow, that smoky, smelly, noisy hut suddenly seemed like the coziest place on earth. When winter locked the land in snow and ice, food became more than just fuel. It became survival. For the Vikings, eating well wasn't about enjoying flavors. It was about keeping warm, keeping strong, and keeping alive. Every calorie mattered, especially when the wind howled and the longhouse walls shook from the cold. Vikings prepared for winter all year. In the warmer months, they worked hard to store food that would last through the dark season. They dried, smoked, salted, or fermented meat and fish. They churned butter, made cheese, and stored grains. If it could be preserved, there were no refrigerators, so they relied on old school methods, and lots of salt. Preserved fish was everywhere. Cod, herring, and other types were dried or salted until they were tough as leather, but impossible to spoil. One dish, lutefisk, involved soaking dried white fish in lye. Yes, the stuff used for soap, until it turned into a strange jelly. It wasn't exactly delicious, but it was safe to eat, and in winter, that was what mattered most. Stews were a winter favorite. People threw whatever they had into a big pot hanging over the fire. Root vegetables like turnips or carrots, bits of meat, oats, and even sour milk went in. The stew would simmer all day, thickening with every hour. It wasn't fancy, but it filled bellies and warmed bodies, and sometimes that stew pot didn't get clean between meals. They just kept adding to it. Think of it as a never-ending soup of survival. Cheese and butter were made in the summer, then stored in cool places for winter. These weren't soft cheeses. They were hard, salty wheels of dairy that could last for months. They were traded, eaten, or even used as weapons against wolves. Yes, seriously, they were that hard. Another Viking favorite was skyr, something between cheese and yogurt. It was super sour and packed with protein. It wasn't tasty, but it kept you alive, and that was the goal. Vikings didn't waste time being picky. If it gave energy, it went in the pot or on the plate. Grains were stored in big sacks: barley, rye, and oats. These were used to make porridge or dense flatbreads. Viking bread was tough and chewy. Sometimes they even mixed and ground up tree bark to stretch the flour further. If you could still chew it after a week, it was considered a success. And of course, there was alcohol. Ale and meat weren't just for celebrations. They had calories, killed bacteria, and made cold nights feel warmer. Mead, made from honey, was sweet, strong, and slightly magical. Even if it tasted bad, people drank it. And if it was really bad, no one stole your cup. When the cold hit hardest, and there wasn't much food left, Vikings turned to animals, not just for meat, but for warmth. Bringing animals inside wasn't weird. It was necessary. Chickens, pigs, goats, and cows were kept in part of the longhouse called the byre. A low wall separated the humans from the animals. Sort of. In truth, everyone was close enough to hear, smell, and occasionally get kicked by each other. On the coldest nights, the whole family might sleep near the cows. Kids might snuggle next to a sheep. If an ox didn't mind, someone used it as a pillow. It wasn't about being cozy. It was about staying alive. Animals gave off heat, just like people. A cow could warm a small room, and it didn't need firewood. Plus, keeping animals inside protected them from thieves, wild animals, and the deadly cold. These weren't just pets or farm tools. They were walking heaters and future meals. Of course, it wasn't perfect. There was noise. There was smell. There was a very real chance of stepping in something awful at night. But Vikings didn't care. They understood the rule of winter. Warmth now, dignity later. This thinking shaped everything. The way they built homes, the way they slept, the way they ate. Every decision was based on what worked, not what looked good or smelled nice. Even their mindset was built for winter. While other cultures might have feared the cold or tried to avoid it, Vikings embraced it. Winter wasn't the enemy, it was the test. And they trained for it their whole lives. They didn't expect comfort. They didn't dream of sunny beaches or easy days. They expected hardship. And when it came, they were ready. That's what made them so strong. Not just big muscles or sharp axes, but a mindset of survival. The cold didn't scare them. It reminded them who they were. They wore wool until they couldn't bend their knees. They ate food that tasted like sour socks. They slept next to cows and smelled like smoke. But they laughed. They told stories. They played games. They made it through together. They were Vikings. And winter didn't beat them. It made them tougher. In the Viking world, winter wasn't just about staying warm. It was about staying together. Even if you had the warmest cloak, the strongest boots, and the biggest house, none of it mattered if you were alone. Vikings believed deeply in community, not just as a nice idea, but as the foundation of survival. Families didn't just live with their parents and kids. They lived with cousins, grandparents, and sometimes neighbors who felt like family. These groups shared everything: food, firewood, tools, stories, and even beds. The more people you kept alive in winter, the stronger your group would be in spring. That was survival math. If your neighbor's roof collapsed under snow, you helped fix it. If someone ran out of cheese, you shared a chunk of yours. Not because you were generous, because you might be the one in need next week. It was a two-way street, and everyone knew it. During feasts like Yule, these bonds were celebrated. People brought out hidden food, even if it was just a turnip or a hard puck of cheese. They sang, laughed, and reminded each other that even in the darkest time of year, they were not alone. These parties weren't just fun. They were mental fuel. In a world with no sunlight and no antidepressants, joy was medicine. Even the way Vikings stored food showed their community mindset. Some villages had shared pantries or smokehouses. If one family's stash ran out, others helped, not just out of kindness, but because the group's survival depended on it. One weak link in the chain could bring everyone down. Leaders were expected to take care of their people. A good chieftain didn't just make decisions, he also made sure nobody froze in a ditch. His reputation depended on how well his people got through winter. If he failed, he lost respect. And in Viking society, losing respect was a big deal. People were held accountable by each other. If someone tried to hoard food or avoid helping with chores, the village would notice. Peer pressure was powerful. Inside-eyed by your whole community was worse than being punished. So, most people did their part, not because they had to, but because they knew they should. Through all the smoke, snow, and sour cheese, one truth remained. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they mastered it. They used every part of their lives, every layer of wool, every shared meal, every bedtime story, to fight the cold together. Every challenge was met with action. If the walls let in drafts, they stuffed them with moss. If the stew was thin, they added bark or oats. If people were bored, they told jokes or wrestled each other for fun. Winter wasn't a season to endure. It was a season to work, learn, laugh, and grow stronger. Vikings didn't need modern gear to stay dry. They made coats out of sheep guts and leather. They didn't need therapy. They had sagas, jokes, and mead. They didn't wait for comfort to come. They built their own comfort with fire, wool, and each other. Even when other civilizations slowed down in winter, the Vikings stayed busy. They fixed tools, trained kids, sharpened weapons, and planned for the future. When spring came, they didn't crawl out weak and worn. They stepped out ready to plant, trade, build, or sail. Their success didn't come from magic. It came from raw determination, a stubborn refusal to quit, a sharp sense of humor in the face of misery, and most of all, teamwork. If they had to sleep under a goat, they did. If they had to eat sour yogurt, they did. If they had to roll in snow after a steam bath, they did that too, and somehow, they found joy in it. This is why the Vikings are remembered not just as warriors, but as survivors. Their real strength wasn't just in battle. It was in how they lived, how they endured, and how they stood together against the darkest. Coldest knights thought winter was never their enemy, it was their teacher, and the Vikings passed every test.